I think it was around 2016, 2017 when I came up with the idea of doing this translation, and was working on it for a while. And my mom is always a big fan and sort of one of my chief publicists next to my wife. And she would always ask me, who is this person you're translating? And I'd say it's Konstantin Paustovsky, this wonderful Russian writer. And she'd look at me and say, no one has ever heard of him. Why are you doing this? Because no one will ever read this book that you're working so hard on. I soldiered on despite her doubts about the project. And then when it was done, gave her a copy, and she simply couldn't put it down. And she was completely enamored with Paustovsky, with the story of a life, and would call me every few days to tell me, about the latest chapter she had read, and how much it meant to her and how beautiful it was. So I'm hoping that maybe today, if some of you haven't read Paustovsky, maybe this will be the impetus to pick up a copy of this truly remarkable work. I love always directing people to this photograph. This is somebody else who really got Paustovsky and truly worshipped him as a writer. This is a photograph that was taken in Moscow in June of 1964 at the Central House of Writers. And it shows Marlene Dietrich, who was then on a world tour with a couple stops in the Soviet Union performing. And when she came to the Soviet Union, she met a group of journalists at the airport in Moscow, and they said, who's the one person you want to meet while you're here? And she said, Konstantin Paustovsky. She had read his novella, The Telegram, in a French translation, and then had read The Story of a Life in a French translation, and she completely fell in love with it. She told the BBC in an interview that if she could only bring one book with her to a desert island, it would be The Story of a Life. So she performed in Moscow. I was about to leave the stage when she was told to wait a minute, and up shuffled this old man in a dark suit, who literally came for the hospital, having had one of his several heart attacks, and was shown up onto the stage. And when she saw him and realized who it was, she couldn't speak to him. He couldn't speak to her. So she literally just dropped to her knees in this photograph as a sign of her utmost respect for the author. What's sort of funny is he was a true gentleman, and he wanted to lift her up. But coming from the hospital after this heart attack, his doctor, who was in the crowd, yelled at her, do not lift her, do not try to bring her back up to her feet. So he stood there awkwardly like this until someone else could come along and help Marlene back up onto her feet. But I think I agree with Marlene Dietrich that, maybe if I could only bring one book with me to a desert island, it would probably be The Story of a Life. So obviously Paustovsky is not, I'd say, a household name. He was born in 1892 in Moscow, in the center of Moscow. His father was a railway statistician. His mother was from an impoverished noble family. And he only lived there for the first 6 years of his life, when the family moved to Kiev. And Kiev really, in a very large sense, became sort of his home, if you will, the roots of Paustovsky, the writer. He grew up there. He spent much of his youth there. He attended the elite First Kiev Gymnasium as a boy. There was another student there who would go on to become also a writer, a man by the name of Mikhail Bulgakov, and they knew each other in school, and he writes about him in Story of a Life. In 1906, when Paustovsky was just a teenager, his father ran off with another woman and left Paustovsky, his mother, his sister, and his two brothers to fend for themselves. And it became sort of this beginning of many, many years of struggle and peripatetic life for Paustovsky. His mother was not able to keep him in school in Kiev, so he was sent off to live with an uncle out in the Ukrainian countryside. In 1914, he made his way to Moscow, excuse me, and enrolled in Moscow University, already at this time dreaming of becoming a writer. But then when the war started, his two brothers, Vadim and Boris, were called up and sent to the front, and he needed to support his mother and sister. So he quit university and got a job as a tram driver in Moscow. And he has wonderful stories, bizarre stories about this experience that he records in Story of a Life. He did that for a period of time, and then he became an orderly on a hospital train in World War I, and experienced and witnessed just the gruesome horrors of fighting during those years. And then he went on to a series of other jobs that took him throughout, the greater Russian Empire. He became a factory worker in an armaments factory for a while. He became a fisherman for a period, and then became a reporter for a series of newspapers in the years right around during the revolution. All the while he was traveling, meeting different people from all sorts of backgrounds, and working on the craft of trying to become a writer. And it was in the 1920s that he began to start publishing some of his first literary works. And then he published two novels in the 1930s that gained him a fair amount of notice. Karabugaz was one that Gorky lauded, and then became the basis for a film, and another called Kolhida. He tried sort of to get in stride, if you will, with sort of the ethos of the era. These books are sort of vaguely socialist realist, but critics of his noticed that in fact they were really at heart adventure stories. They were full of sort of romanticism and that sort of thing, which led to Paustovsky being criticized as lacking what the Russians would call then partiynost, sort of strong conviction in the Communist Party, a party that he never joined, never became a Communist Party member, and that he was somehow not fully committed to the political line of the Soviet Union at the time. By the mid-late 1930s, he became convinced that he was sort of being singled out as sort of a nonconformist writer, and decided perhaps the best thing for him to do would be to, in a sense, make himself scarce. And he moved out of Moscow to a village called Salocha in Ryazan Oblast, and basically remained there for over a decade or so. Continued to write, but he moved away from anything that would have smacked of politics, which he was never terribly interested in to begin with, writing works about the countryside, writing works about Russian authors. He also wrote a number of screenplays. He wrote a huge number of short stories, including children's literature and things like that. And it was while he was living in Salocha during World War II in 1943 that he began what would become sort of the basis of Story of a Life, these early autobiographical pieces about his childhood and growing up. And it was basically the shift that began in the early 40s that would consume him up until his death in 1968, when he would have completed by then 6 volumes of the Story of a Life, a work that he didn't envision necessarily as a life autobiography, but that with each subsequent volume, he became more and more committed to seeing this as one larger work, if you will. And it was the Story of a Life that really made Paustovsky's reputation. It was in the 1960s that these works were translated into all of basically the major world languages. He became hugely popular in England with these translations, in Germany and France, as we saw with Marlene Dietrich. And he was also hugely popular back home in the Soviet Union. Part of it was his writing. Part of it was also sort of who he was as a man. He never denounced another writer. He never put his signature on any sort of attack against other writers or cultural figures. As I said, he never joined the Communist Party. He never sort of engaged in hack writing for political purposes. And this made him this sort of moral figure, a sort of moral authority in the Soviet Union in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s. I visited Tarusa, the town where he lived at the time, south of Moscow on the Oka River. And he built a little writing shed for himself where he could work. But once word got out that he was using the shed to write, people would literally gather opposite the writer's hut of his in this field to actually try to watch him work. They were so obsessed with him. So he had to plant a row of trees to sort of shield himself and give him some privacy to do his work. It was during the 60s that Paustovsky was nominated several times for the Nobel Prize in Literature. In 1965, everyone was convinced that he was going to win, everyone except for Paustovsky. He was in Italy at the time, and he told some reporters that there was no way that a nonconformist such as himself would win the Nobel Prize. And in fact, he was right. The prize instead went to Mikhail Sholokhov for Quiet Flows the Dawn, chiefly as a result of a good deal of behind-the-scenes pressure by the Soviet government on the committee in Stockholm, saying, you know, you're not doing this again. You did it to us with Pasternak a few years ago, who we were not happy about, and we are not going to be happy if you do this sort of thing again and give it to Paustovsky. He kind of realized, I think, that there was no way that he would ever be given such a prize. It's kind of interesting. He and Pasternak knew each other. They exchanged some correspondence. Paustovsky was at his funeral. There's one line I like, though, is when The Story of a Life was reviewed in the New York Times in the 1960s, when it first came out in an English translation. The reviewer so loved Paustovsky's work and so much preferred it to Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago that he referred to it as a cosmic literary injustice, that Pasternak's work was better known and maybe more lauded than Paustovsky's. As for me, I found Paustovsky just by accident. I was a student studying German and Russian at the University of Vermont in the early 1980s. And I was in a bookstore and I saw this book, The Story of a Life, with this Russian author's name on it. And I picked it up and it looked interesting. Didn't know anything about the author or the book. And I read it and I absolutely fell in love with it. It was sort of this window opening up onto this world that I still knew basically nothing about. Russia in the years leading up from sort of the late Tsarist period up to the end of the Russian Civil War. I passed the book along to all of my friends. I told everybody to read it. And eventually I gave it to somebody and they lent it to somebody else, and I never saw it again. But for me, Paustovsky was the real entry into sort of my love affair with Russia, which is unusual. I know most people maybe fall in love with Russia via Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Chekhov or something. But for me, it was Paustovsky. Fast forward to 2015, and I was back in Moscow, and I was walking through Kuzminki Park, and I noticed off one of the paths there this small grayish house with some plaques on the outside, and I was just sort of curious what it was. So I walked up, and I noticed that it was a museum dedicated to Paustovsky. So I said, well, I have to obviously go in here. And I hadn't really thought about him or his work in quite a while. And going to the museum, I was sort of brought back into his orbit, into his world. I bought now a copy of Story of a Life, Повесть о жизни, in Russian, which I could obviously now read. And rereading it brought me back to the wonder that I had when I first read the book, but was able to appreciate it that much more after years of study of the place and language and times spent in Russia and the Soviet Union. And I decided that, you know, this book really did need to get back out into circulation again. So what I had hoped to do was to go back to these earlier translations and see if I could have them reprinted and maybe write a new introduction or something like that. There was a man by the name of Joseph Barnes who translated the first 3 volumes of Story of a Life that came out in the United States in like 1963 or 64. And then in the UK, Manya Harari, who was a pretty well-known translator of Russian writers at the same time, she, working with a group of other people for various volumes, ended up doing a translation of all 6 volumes that were published individually in the 1960s. So what I did was I thought, well, which of these translations would be the best? And so I started comparing the Barnes and the Harari translations to the Russian original. And I realized that the translations, in my opinion, weren't really all that good. There was quite a number of errors and mistakes, passages left out, some of the poetry he quotes left out. Sometimes entire chapters were not included. And I think this was not necessarily because they were not good translators, but they had to do these translations very, very quickly. There was a time pressure because of this belief that Paustovsky was going to win the Nobel Prize, and they needed to have these works out to sort of catch that wave and sell them. So what I decided to do then was to do my own translation, to go back and just sort of start afresh. And that's what I ended up doing. It took me a while to find who, in fact, had the English rights to Paustovsky's works, which, with the help of my agent, we tracked down to Vintage in the UK, signed a contract with them. And so I ended up spending most of the pandemic years, after already having worked with Paustovsky's archives in Moscow for a while, translating. So what I'd like to do now, if I could, is just to read a passage, give you some flavor for Paustovsky's writing. This is from the very first chapter, which is called The Death of My Father. And it takes place in 1909 on a small farm in the town called Gorodishche. And he has traveled there to see his father one last time before he dies. And he records what it's like in the house there with his father dying, and then what happens immediately after. An old man named Nechipor lived with us on the island. We called him to come and read the Psalms over father. Nechipor frequently broke off his readings to go out into the front hall and smoke his cheap tobacco. There, in a whisper, he'd tell me the simple stories that stirred his imagination. About a bottle of wine he'd drunk the previous summer at Belaya Tserkov, about how he'd seen Skobelev himself, so close, in fact, as that hedge right there at Plevna, about an amazing American thresher machine powered by a lightning rod. Old man Nechipor was, as they said on the island, a simple man, a liar and a gas bag. He read the Psalms all day and throughout the following night, picking wax off the sides of the candles with his black fingernails, falling asleep where he stood, snorting himself awake, and then carrying on with his mumbled prayers. That night, someone on the other side of the river began yelling and waving a lantern. I went to the riverbank with Uncle Ilko. The river was raging. The water raced over the causeway in an icy cascade. It was late and dark. Not a single star shone over our heads. The wind blew the raw freshness of the flood and thawing earth into our faces. And the whole time, someone on the far bank kept shouting and waving a lantern, but not a word could be made out over the noise of the river. That must be Mama, I said to Uncle Ilko, but he did not respond. Let's go, he said, and then was quiet. It's cold out here on the banks. You'll catch cold. I didn't want to go back to the house. Uncle Ilko was silent for a while and then left, but I stayed and kept watching the lantern in the distance. The wind blew ever stronger, bending the poplars and carrying the slightly sweet smoke of burning straw from somewhere far off. We buried father in the morning. Nechipor and Uncle Ilko dug a grave in the grove on the edge of the ravine. From there, one could make out the woods beyond the River Ross in the distance and the whitish March sky. We carried the coffin from the house on wide embroidered straps. The priest walked in front. He looked straight ahead with his calm gray eyes and murmured Latin prayers. Once we got the coffin out onto the steps, I caught sight on the far side of the river of an old carriage with some untethered horses and a small woman in black, Mama. She was standing motionless on the riverbank. She saw that we were carrying father from the house. She dropped to her knees and her head fell to the ground. The tall, gaunt driver went up and leaned over her. He said something, but she just lay there, not moving. Then she jumped up and began running along the bank towards the causeway. The driver grabbed her. She sank helplessly to the ground and covered her face with her hands. We carried father along the road to the grave. At the bend, I turned to look at Mama, who was still sitting with her face buried in her hands. We were all silent. But Bregman kept slapping his whip against the side of his boot. By the graveside, the priest lifted his eyes to the cold sky and then said clearly and slowly, "Grant unto him eternal rest, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him." Then the priest fell silent and listened. The river roared, and overhead the tomtits called to each other in the branches of the old elms. The priest sighed and began to speak again about man's eternal longing for happiness and the valley of tears. These words were remarkably fitting for my father's life. They made my heart ache. Ever since, I have often felt that same pain, when confronting this thirst for happiness and the imperfection of human relations. The river kept on roaring, the birds whistled cautiously, and as the coffin was slowly lowered on its straps into the grave, it knocked loose clods of damp earth. I was then 17. So my original plan for the translation was to try to do an abridged version of all 6 of the volumes. But I sort of quickly realized that all of it was so good, I didn't want to cut anything out. I felt like I was, somehow being unfair to both Paustovsky, the writer, and potential readers if I was to take things out. And I also realized that if I started to cut things out, I would have to add text in to explain kind of where we were now in the book. In other words, I would have to insert my voice into the text, which would in no way improve the overall effect. And then I also realized that while I was working with Paustovsky's archives in Moscow, that volumes 4 through 6, he was only able to publish once he had accepted a fair number of fairly serious changes and cuts. I mean, in a sense, basically, he was forced to accept a certain degree of censorship of what it was he wanted to write. I mean, just one example was Paustovsky became friends with Isaac Babel and wrote a good deal about Babel in some of the later volumes of Story of a Life. And there was no way, for example, that the editors at like Novelistic Memoir, who was one of his publishers at the time, were going to allow him to write all these things about a man who had been executed as an enemy of the people. So I thought, well, it would be foolish to try to do a new translation of these later volumes as they exist in the published Russian form, knowing that this is really not what Paustovsky ultimately really wanted to publish. So I thought, well, I'll put that aside and hopefully be able to work with his manuscripts and come back and do that later. And so I went ahead and did a full version of the first 3 volumes, also hoping that if they sold well and the publisher was happy, that they would want me to carry on and do volumes 4 through 6. I'd like to do another reading. This is from a chapter called Pink Oleanders that describes sort of the imagination that he had as a child that would never leave him and was so central to his artistry. My grandmother always kept oleanders in green tubs on the veranda of her home in Cherkasy. They had pink petals. I liked their grayish leaves and pale flowers very much. For some reason, I associated them with the sea, a distant, warm sea bathing the shores of a land that blossomed with oleanders. Grandmother had a way with flowers. Her bedroom in the winter months was always overflowing with fuchsias. In the summer, the garden exploded with flowers, taking on the appearance of a giant bouquet, and burdock crowded the fences. The scent of all those flowers made its way inside to grandfather's room on the mezzanine and drove out the tobacco fug. Grandfather would angrily slam the windows shut. He liked to say that flowers aggravated his chronic asthma. At the time, I imagined the flowers to be living beings. Mignonette was the poor girl in a darned gray dress, but her remarkable scent gave away her fairy tale lineage. The yellow tea roses were young beauties who had lost their rosy cheeks from drinking too much tea. The bed with pansies looked like a masked ball. These were not flowers, but happy and playful gypsies in black velvet masks, florid dancers, now blue, now purple, now yellow. I didn't like the daisies. With their faded pink dresses, they reminded me of the little daughters of the schoolmaster Zimmer, my grandmother's neighbor. The girls were tow-headed and had no eyebrows. Every time you met them, they would curtsy, their fingers daintily touching the edge of their skirts. The most interesting flower was, of course, the purslane, a creeper covered with the purest colors. Instead of leaves, the purslane had soft, juicy needles. If you gave them a slight squeeze, they'd spray green juice in your face. Grandmother's garden and all the flowers in it acted on my imagination with uncommon force. My passion for travel must have been born in that garden as well. In my childhood, I used to imagine a faraway country that I was certain to visit. It was a hilly plain covered as far as the horizon with grass and flowers, and hidden in among them were villages and towns. When express trains crossed the plain, thick pollen would cover the sides of the carriages. I would tell this to my brothers, my sister, and Mama, but no one cared to understand me. Rather, when he first heard this, my elder brother called me a dreamer, a contemptuous nickname that stuck. Perhaps the only person who understood me was my Aunt Nadia, the youngest of my grandmother's daughters. She was 23 at the time and studying singing at the Moscow Conservatory. She had a beautiful contralto voice. She would come to grandmother's in Cherkasy for Easter in the summer. The quiet, spacious house became noisy and crowded as soon as she arrived. Slender and graceful, with tousled fair hair and fresh lips parted ever so slightly, she played with us and rushed headlong up and down the polished floors, laughing as she went. Flecks of gold sparkled in her gray eyes. These eyes responded to everything with a laugh, to any joke, joyful word, even to Anton, the tomcat, who looked upon our games disapprovingly with the most critical expression. It's all fun and games for Aunt Nadia, Mama liked to say with mild criticism. Her happy-go-lucky nature was proverbial in our family, and she was always losing things, her gloves, her powder, her money, but she never let anything upset her. We opened up the piano the day she arrived, and it remained open until Aunt Nadia left for her cheerful, hospitable Moscow. Piles of sheet music littered the chairs. The candles smoked. The piano rumbled, and sometimes at night I awoke to the sound of her deep yet delicate voice singing a barcarolle. Sail, my gondola, lit by the moon. Ring out, barcarolle, over the slumberous waves. And in the morning I was awakened by an ingratiating voice, almost a whisper, by my ear, and Aunt Nadia's hair tickling my cheeks as she sang, "It's time to get up. It's no time to slumber. Your eyes closed, having abandoned yourself to your reveries. The robins have been calling for some time, and for you the roses have opened up." I opened up my eyes. She kissed me, and then suddenly disappeared. Yet a moment later, I could hear her how she and her brother, Uncle Kolya, a cadet, were twirling through the hall in a rushing waltz. He too sometimes came to visit my grandmother from St. Petersburg for Easter. Then I would hop out of bed, sensing that the day was going to be wild, cheerful, and full of surprises. I like this passage because it does speak to the incredible imagination that Paustovsky had, his imaginative powers, his sense of wonderment at sort of all the beauty that the world had in store. And it's something that he was criticized for at times, that, in other words, that, you know, he was so enraptured by the beauty and everything that he wasn't always able to see life's uglier sides. But it's something that he writes about, which I found very interesting, is that he says that no matter how ugly life got, that he was always able to somehow find the beauty in it, that no matter how difficult things were, how challenging, how fraught, he sort of never gave up his hope, his belief in humanity, and his, I guess, wonderment is the best word, sort of wonderment at sort of just the lived experience, which I find first of all, quite refreshing. And I don't know how others would feel, but in some ways I find it very non-typical of much of the Russian literature that I have read. That said, it is true that he lived through some of the great horrors of the 20th century. He experienced at firsthand the bloodshed of the First World War. Both of his brothers were killed in the fighting. He saw a good deal of violence himself. He experienced both the February Revolution and the October Revolution, had brushes with death on numerous occasions. He witnessed the Russian Civil War and was in fact forced into a sort of criminal brigade and forced to do a bit of fighting himself. And he never really shies away from any of this in the book. The atrocities that he witnessed are there, but they're very much sort of mixed in with all of the beauty that he still saw all around him. And I wanted to do one final reading that sort of speaks to some of these horrors. This is set during World War I, when he was billeted in a synagogue in the village of Kobrin, actually more of a Jewish shtetl, if you will, in what is Belarus. And the people had been starving there. And so he and the others that he was serving with in this hospital train had managed to boil this huge vat of basically of soup from a slaughtered cow. And there was a huge throng of people who were basically starving and desperate to get at this kettle of boiling soup. And a stampede takes place. And in the crush, a young boy is trampled to death, a boy who had been taken in by Paustovsky and his fellows, and also the boy's sister, that they were trying to keep safe and somehow find some place to put them where they would be out of harm's way. But in fact, the boy ends up being trampled as people make a rush for the soup, and the body has been taken back into the synagogue. Wooden shacks on the edge of town had been set on fire. The glow flickered in the puddles, intensifying the chaotic impression of carts, guns, horses, and wagons, that confused mass of a nighttime retreat. I returned to the synagogue. The girl was not there. The boy lay on the coat as though asleep, his cheek pressed against the wet cloth. The fire was dying, and I didn't find anyone in the damp, dark synagogue other than the elderly Jew who sat beside the boy and was still muttering his prayers or his curses. "Where is everyone?" I asked him. "How should I know?" he answered with a sigh. "Everyone wants some hot soup." He paused for a moment and then went on in a low, clear voice. "Sir, I am a saddle maker. My name is Joseph Schifrin. I don't know how to say what is in my heart. Sir, we Jews know from our prophets that God punishes the wicked. But where is he? Our God. Why did he not rip out the eyes of the men responsible for this misfortune? Why did he not smite them with fire?" "God? What's God got to do with it?" I said rudely. "You talk like a stupid old man." He gave me a sad smile. "Listen," he said, and touched the sleeve of my coat. "Listen, you are intelligent and educated." He paused again. A steady glow shone through the synagogue's dusty windows. "I've been sitting here thinking. I don't know as well as you who exactly is responsible for all this. I didn't go to school. I didn't even go to the cheder, but I am not completely blind, and I do see a few things. And so I ask you, sir, who will make them pay? Who will make them pay, and pay dearly for this little boy? Or are you all so kind and good that you'll pity and forgive them? Those people who gave us this nice little present, who gave us this war? Oh my God, when will people finally come together and make a decent life for themselves?" He stretched his arms up towards the ceiling of the synagogue, closed his eyes, and swaying back and forth, let out a piercing cry. "Where is the man who will avenge us? I don't see the man who will dry the tears of the suffering and give milk to the mothers whose babies suckle at their empty breasts. Where is he who will sow the fields with grain for the hungry? Where is he who will take the gold from the rich and give to the poor? May those who stain men's hands with blood and rob the poor be cursed until the end of time. May they have no children, no grandchildren. May their seed rot and their own spittle turn to poison in their mouths. May the air they breathe turn to sulfur and the water they drink to boiling tar. May the blood of this child poison the bread of the rich, and may they choke on it and die in anguish like tormented dogs. The old man was screaming. He held out his balled fists and shook them at the ceiling. His voice thundered through the synagogue. I was terrified and went out. Leaning back against the wall of the synagogue, I lit a cigarette. It was drizzling, and the black of the night was slowly settling upon the ground. The darkness seemed to deliberately shut me in with my thoughts about the war. One thing was clear to me. No matter what, we had to put an end to it. We had to use all of our strength and every last drop of our blood to bring peace and justice at long last to this desecrated, beggared earth. I kind of like to read that because I think that's something that we really need to be mindful of, obviously, these days with so much of what's going on in the world. I mentioned earlier that I had been to Tarusa, south of Moscow, where Paustovsky had spent much of sort of his later years living and writing, wanting to be generally outside Moscow. His house there is now also a museum that you can tour, and I was fortunate to get a tour of it with his stepdaughter, who is still alive, a very vibrant older woman who told me all sorts of stories about what life was like with Paustovsky. And then I went out in search of his grave, and I found it not far from where that house is. And I was struck when I saw that it had a massive metal Orthodox cross atop the grave. And it seemed really strange to me because everything I had learned about Paustovsky, he was not in any way religious. And in fact, if you read the story of life and other things he wrote, he was definitely not a believing Christian. He was definitely not a member of the Russian Orthodox Church. And in fact, much of what he has to say about organized religion is in fact quite negative. And then I did a bit of research, and I realized that this massive heavy cross was obviously added only recently, was never part of the original grave site of Paustovsky. But I wanted to include it because I think it sort of it speaks to the temper of the Russia of today, unfortunately. This aggressive, nationalistic, intolerant Russia that we see that has taken shape under Putin. And it seems to me that it is precisely now with what we're seeing sadly happening to Russia, these voices of intolerance that now sort of rule the day there, that Paustovsky and his voice is more important than ever. You can't come away from reading Paustovsky and knowing about him, his life, his personality, and his character, and not see that he was sort of a voice for reason, for tolerance, for accepting the humanity in all people, even in people we might consider our enemies. And that it is sad, but this is exactly, I would say, the most important time that we read somebody like Paustovsky. And I just wanted to end today, before opening up to questions. This was from a review of my translation that was published in the Telegraph in the UK last year. The reviewer's name is Julian Evans, and he wrote this: "When Russia, as now, is at one of its darkest hours, we should treasure Paustovsky's reflection of his native land, that most magnificent gift of our lives," to quote Paustovsky. as both a sparkling, supremely precious literary achievement and an infinitely more enduring thing than the present regime's regressive dishonesty. And I can't think of a better way to sort of end this talk today. So thank you very much.
In the meantime, we got a very interesting question from Patricia. She wonders, in your research of Paustovsky, did you ever find any evidence that he wrote for the drawer? And if so, what was that writing like? I remember you, Douglas, mentioned that you worked in archives, so maybe you found something interesting.
Yeah, good question. No, I didn't find in my research, and again, I was kind of focusing really on trying to uncover sort of early drafts and communication around these first three volumes of Story of a Life. So I wasn't able to like dig as deeply and widely in his archive as I would have liked to. Um, Side note, I mean, this is often one of the things that you just can't plan for. So Paustovsky's archive is mostly in Moscow at the Russian is the Российский государственный архив литературы и искусства, the Russian State Archive of Literature and Art. And so I confirmed with them before going there that the archive was, open and functioning. This was, I think, 2016, 17. And I get there and they said, "Oh, well, yeah, we are open, but we had a fire. And part of the archive has been burned, and Paustovsky's papers are not destroyed as far as we understand, but we can't get to them because where the fire is, his papers are on the other side of that." And so I was only able to get certain materials and not everything. So I don't know what all is there. Um, I don't know if he wrote things and knew that they couldn't be published, so he kept them in the desk drawer or something like that. I think, the thing about Paustovsky is he was someone who really wasn't a political animal. He was not a dissident. He was not a full-throated critic of the Soviet system. And in fact, he was criticized by some writers for this. Shalama, for one, said, Paustovsky, didn't take a stand, and he didn't, denounce the gulag and the terror of the state and that kind of thing. And in that sense, it is true. He was somebody who was not like, bent on bringing down the Soviet Union. That said, he found his own quiet way, I would say, of criticizing the Soviet Union. And if you read his work very carefully, thoughtfully, you will see that what he's doing is critiquing. Like in the Story of the Life, I mean, just a couple examples. He writes about the February Revolution, the fall of the Romanovs, glowingly as a truly great moment in Russia's struggle for freedom. And it's obvious his support for the February Revolution. The way he writes about the Bolshevik seizure of power in October, though, is very, very different. It's not presented as a further step on the road to freedom, but in fact is presented as a bloody coup and a time of extreme violence. And there's nothing heroic about it. There's nothing praiseworthy about it. And it is kind of remarkable that he was able to, write that when he did and publish it. And then he also found like these ways to, I would say, memorialize the losses and to pay tribute to people who had suffered from the Soviet experience. And one really amazing example, I think, is in the book. He writes lovingly of his uncle Kolya, who he was sent off to live with after his father left the family. And he has a great deal to say about what a wonderful man he was, and living with him and his aunt was just so formative in his growing up and everything. Well, I did some research into this Uncle Kolya. Well, Kolya ended up moving to Moscow and working, I think, in the armaments industry in the Soviet Union, and was then arrested at the height of the Great Terror, and was then assassinated as an enemy of the people. Now, as we know, persons who had family members who were arrested and shot as enemies of the people tended not to want to talk about them, right? You would erase these people from your family biography because it was dangerous to be connected to them. And here he is, writing in the 1940s and 50s, so warmly and fondly about this person who had been utterly, destroyed by the Soviet system. He doesn't come out and say that, but it is this sort of memorializing. So that's maybe a long answer. I don't know if I fully answered, Patricia, your question, but it does speak that he was aware of these kinds of things, but he was not an active and engaged dissident or something like that.
Thank you, Douglas. We received a very interesting specific question from Amelia. She thanks you for the lecture, and she wants to know um, how the dialogue feels in Paustovsky text. Is it naturalistic? Amelia says it seems so in English, but it's also quite grand. So maybe you can speak a little more about the dialogue and how he builds it.
Yeah, that's good. Translating this was a challenge because I find that his language is deceptively simple. It's unadorned. It's not flashy. There's no pyrotechnics. This is not Nabokov or something like that. And what I found was fascinating is looking at some of his manuscripts, handwritten manuscript copies from these drafts of Story of a Life, is how hard he worked to create this kind of direct, simple, unadorned language. He was constantly revising and editing and cutting to try to sort of always tighten his language and make it as sort of direct as possible. And so one of the challenges I faced in translating was to mimic that style and not in any way add too many words to feel like, oh, I'm going to make it more poetic or something like that, but to try to let it naturally flow through me, which is always an act, is never natural, it's always a creation. In terms of the dialogue, that was of the same piece. I mean, the dialogue is always very direct. It's always, I would say, there's an emotional inflection or flavor there, but I was always careful not to want to make it any sweeter or more powerful, but to do it mimicking the tone that he uses in the book, which was hard. I was very slow. I would literally sometimes only translate 2 pages in a day. And what is the first 3 volumes are how many pages? 800 pages. Sometimes I wondered if I'd ever finish. So it was very slow, very arduous on my behalf. And it is interesting. I often thought about the conversations and the recorded speech, because he often has full conversations that go back to his childhood. And obviously he doesn't know all of this for a fact, right? This is the imaginative process that is going on when he's, recording conversations that he had with his school teachers, or maybe with his grandmother or something like that. And he's, a 9-year-old. This is what is sort of the artistic side of this work. This is not a standard autobiography of dates and facts and that kind of thing, but it's very much an artistic recreation of his life as he remembers it and how he thinks about it.
Speaking about Paustovsky background and the ideology he was surrounded with, there's an interesting question how he got away with not following the party line, how he was still able to write in the Soviet era, and how much it influenced him and his writing.
Yeah, I think, the fact that he survived Stalin, I think is just a quirk of fate. I mean, there are these writers and cultural figures who you look at and you go, wait, how did they survive? How were they not imprisoned? How were they not locked up? Akhmatova survived, and we can probably name others as well. And I think, some of it was just dumb luck and fate on one hand, and I think there was a conscious strategy on his part. By the sort of mid-30s, he had a very clear sense that he was not well liked by both by the party higher-ups and by the bureaucrats that ran the writers' union. And he knew that he was criticized as being, a romantic, that he wasn't committed to the Soviet cause and that sort of thing that I mentioned. he was aware of that. And I think, his moving to Salocha, far off the, beaten track, if you will. I don't know if you can fully call it an internal immigration, but it was trying to make himself less visible. Getting away from Moscow was, I think, an intentional strategy. And that's where, like, he wrote a book, for example, on the artist Levitin. That was something for him, as a way of like exploring creativity and his wonder with art, and his love of the Russian natural environment and what have you, in ways that were clearly avoiding meddling in direct political topics. One of his famous books was sort of an homage to the beauty of Mishora, that area where he lived. And then, he wrote the screenplay for a film, sort of a biopic about Lermontov, that had a score from Prokofiev. Again, projects that he could do that kind of avoided having to take on the political realities head on. And again, some could criticize that, and maybe that's a valid criticism. But again, he just did not want to get caught up in writing things that would be used by the state for its propaganda purposes. But at the same time, again, he was no dissident. He was not somebody that was out to expose the horrors of the Soviet experience at that time and risk his own life. So, I'd say in that sense, there's sort of a balancing act that he was trying to carry out. This really changes, though, with the death of Stalin. Once Stalin is gone, he becomes a very prominent voice, speaking out for writers that had been oppressed. He very much is, behind the thaw movement in the Khrushchev eras, even though Khrushchev couldn't stand him. And he helped to bring back the careers and the writings of writers who had been oppressed. There was a famous anthology that he was one of the leading forces behind, Taruskие Straniцы, or Pages from Tarusa, which had the writings of people like Tsvetaeva and others who had, sort of been swept aside. And younger writers in the 50s and 60s came to Paustovsky to sort of sit at his knee and learn from him, and sort of learn about what it was like before the revolution, and also just to sort of have him help them with their beginning careers.
Yeah, you already mentioned some of his works, some of his other texts, but let's imagine I have no idea who Paustovsky is, and I'm not ready for the story of a life yet. Where should I start from? Can you recommend a couple of maybe books or short stories that might be interesting and that will give you this basic sense of who Paustovsky is as a writer?
Yeah, that's fair. I would say don't give up on trying Story of a Life. It is big, it's intimidating, but what's remarkable, for those who've already read it, the chapters are short. So you can get into bed at night and you look and you go, oh God, I'm tired. And you go, okay,
Like
chapter.
Netflix.
Yeah. And you go, wait, this chapter is only 6 pages. I can do 6 pages before I fall asleep. And each chapter reads like a finished short story. So there's so you can read them one at a time. If not that, there are several collections of his short stories that you can get. There haven't been any recent English publications of his short stories. They were all done in the 60s and 70s by various Soviet publishers, but you can find these. His other really famous work is called The Telegram, that I mentioned earlier, that Marlene Dietrich had so loved. You can find The Telegram in English. You can also, I would recommend, I don't know if they have subtitles, but if you speak Russian, or you can check, they maybe have subtitles. But for example, The Telegram was made into a short film, Soviet film, you can watch on YouTube. And then there's also a really beautiful short story he had called The Rainy Dawn. I think it's called Daždливый рассвет. I think it's called that was also filmed. And I think you can, that might also have subtitles with it. And I think the famous Oleg Yefremov actor is in the starring role. That's a really beautiful short piece. So, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of recent English language publications of his works. And it's something I sometimes toy around with, is maybe trying to do new translations of some of his better known short stories. And then his first novel called The Romantics, I really enjoyed, but I don't believe that that has been ever been translated.
It's actually surprising that it feels like in Russia, Paustovsky is not as popular, and abroad he is barely known. Why do you think it's the case, considering the fact that he is actually the voice for reason and tolerance, as you mentioned in your lecture? Do you think he will become more popular, taking into account all the historical background and all the events we live with?
And an answer, no, I don't think he will sadly become more popular. I remember when I last in Moscow, which was 2019 before the war, and having dinner with a good friend of mine there, Russian, and he's, asking me what all I've been working on and everything. And I told him I was, doing this Paustovsky thing, and he was like, Paustovsky. And for him, as a Russian in his probably early 50s, he goes, when I hear the name Paustovsky, I envision a man in like a really heavy, dark wool raincoat with thick glasses and a black hat. And I said, well, yeah, that's pretty accurate. I think that's kind of what Paustovsky. And I think, I don't know, he's not a modernist. He wasn't experimental. He was very much part of this sort of traditional idealist tradition of Russian literature. Um, I think one of his favorite writers of all time was Bunin, and he kind of fits in that tradition of someone like Bunin. Who reads Bunin anymore? I mean, I don't know. Maybe some people do. Um, I feel like I have tried to bring Paustovsky back a bit with these translations. I mean, as you mentioned yourself, Anastasia, Russian school kids have often read Paustovsky, his short stories and things like that.
Yeah, mostly
Sometimes
short,
that one, pardon?
mostly short stories. Yeah. It,
Yeah, and I sometimes worry that if young people are forced to read some author in school, that maybe instead of opening their eyes to that writer, may function as a form of poison and make them not want to go back to it. So, uh, I don't hold out tons of hope. I mean, it's also just the world we live in now, right? I mean, we're on TikTok, we're on Instagram. I will speak for myself. I don't read as many novels in a year as I used to, and I'm not really even on social media. But there are just so many ways to distract ourselves, ways that didn't exist, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I don't think that bodes real well for Paustovsky, but we'll try to keep the fire burning and hope that some people will be drawn to him.